Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's third webinar of 2026 titled Gender Neutral Language and Healthcare Interpreting. We are so glad you have joined us today. We really are. Before we start, we want to hear from you. So please feel free to drop in the chat where you're connecting from. And also, if you speak a language other than Spanish, please let us know what language that is. Again, we love seeing how global our community is. And FYI, we have some amazing ASL interpreters with us today. Thank you, ladies, for joining the session. Okay, my name is Ana Lia Lang. I am the Manager of Training and Curriculum at Cross Cultural Communications. I am joined by my colleague, Naisel Zavala, our Administrative Support Specialist. Naisel will be managing the chat and sharing helpful links throughout the webinar. Before we start, we would like to share our upcoming training opportunities. The links to the training will be posted on the chat. And just a reminder that CCC operates on Eastern Time. Okay, on our April workshop, Translation for Community Interpreters, will be held on April 18th and 25th from 12 to 5 p.m. This workshop is aimed at Spanish and French-speaking community interpreters who are looking to develop foundational translation. In this hands-on program, participants will explore 10 steps in the translation process, apply essential translation principles and strategies to short sample materials used in community settings. Next, we have a few spots left for our spring session of the Community Interpreter International Training of Trainers. Attend this online training of trainers and learn how to lead your own sessions of the most widely taught national 40-hour licensed certified program for community, educational, and medical interpreters. Okay, this training is going to start this coming Monday, March 16th through April the 3rd. And if you're interested in the summer session, it will start on July 13th. So just let us know. Okay, enough of announcements. Let's talk about the presentation, the webinar today. It will run for about 50 minutes, followed by a Q&A. Please use the Q&A feature to submit questions for our presenter. For general comments on questions for CCC, feel free to use the chat and make sure it is set to everyone if you would like for your message to be visible to everyone else. The webinar has been approved for CE use. Within 48 hours, you will receive an email with a link to download your certificate of attendance. Please be sure to check your spam or junk folder if you don't see it. Certificates are available only to the live attendees and must be downloaded within 3 weeks of today's session, so do not delay. Once downloaded, remember to add your name, okay? You have to have your name and save a copy for your records. Okay, enough about that. This is the best part. Let's get started. I am delighted to welcome my friend, Mateo Rutherford. Mateo, come in. Let me tell you about Mateo. Alrighty, Mateo has been a freelance conference interpreter since 1987, working and presenting at conferences, listen to this, throughout the United States of America, Latin America, Europe, and Asia. He's a nationally certified healthcare interpreter and a member in good standing of the American Translators Association, the California Healthcare Interpreting Association, and the National Council on Interpreting in Healthcare. He is also Chair Emeritus of the Certification Commission for Healthcare Interpreters. Mateo, thank you. You know, I'm so excited you're here. Thank you for joining us. With that, I am going to disappear. Ta-da, abracadabra, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Analia. I'm going to ask people to do me a favor. Just shoot in the text. If you speak a language other than Spanish, put your language in the text, because if everybody speaks Spanish, we can go through the presentation a bit faster. Okay, and I see there's a lot of other languages, so I will take my time. Um, I hope you can see my slides, and I'm sure somebody will let me know if you cannot see them. And let me hide my controls. All right, let's jump right in. Um, so this is a national survey that we did of healthcare interpreters back in 2020. COVID had just hit. We were all in lockdown. We figured we should do something to help engage the community. And this was commissioned by the Certification Commission for Healthcare Interpreters. At the time, I was on the commission, and the commission is a rotating responsibility. So I am no longer on the commission, but I still am actively involved with CCHI, and help them with everything that they need help with. So first and foremost, I want to thank the Certification Commission for Healthcare Interpreters and all of the commissioners who supported this project. And I want to thank the 1,244 healthcare interpreters across the US who completed this survey and gave us this data. So what did we do and why did we do it? The national survey was conducted in spring of 2020 to collect awareness, solutions, and attitudes of healthcare interpreters when dealing with gender neutral terms in English, because interpreters are dealing with this on a daily basis. It's not a theoretical linguistic discussion for them. It's something that they need to solve in the moment, when it comes up and they're working. So we wanted to focus on languages with grammatical gender, such as Spanish, Portuguese, French, Russian, and how they deal with the English gender neutral terms. So grammatical gender is the use of masculine or feminine in Spanish. We're focusing on Spanish because that's the language that we had most participants for. So we were able to do some nice analysis with them. In Spanish, because I know in Russian and other languages, the way they use gender is a little bit different, but in Spanish, if you have a noun, it's usually either a masculine noun or a feminine noun. There are very few examples of nouns that are either both masculine and feminine. And then the article that goes with that noun has to also be in masculine, feminine, and the adjectives as well. Some languages, the verb changes between masculine and feminine. So for example, in English, if you say he is reading the red book has no gender. But in Spanish, book is masculine. So the article that it is associated with book must be masculine. And the adjective associated with book, in this case, red, must also be in the masculine form. So in Spanish, it would be él lee el libro rojo. He reads the red book. And then in English, she is reading the red magazine. Magazine doesn't have a gender in English, but in Spanish, magazine is feminine. So now the article instead of el for libro becomes la for revista. And the adjective red instead of rojo for masculine becomes roja for feminine. So that's our Spanish lesson for today. And of course, in English, the he and the she are the only gendered part of these sentences. So grammatical gender may or may not be related to human gender. Example, el hombre is masculine, but la próstata, which only men have, or biological or men who were born with XY chromosomes, is feminine in Spanish. La mujer is feminine, but ovaries are masculine. So the words themselves are kind of random. Of course, when we're speaking about people, we would use the gender associated with the gender we perceive that person to be. So if I say the tall man, the word tall I would use in the masculine form. If it were a tall woman, I would use the word tall in the feminine form. So English can be more easily adapted to gender neutral forms of speech. And interpreters may encounter phrases that are gender neutral in English, but require a gendered rendition in Spanish. For example, my name is Dr. Mora. In Spanish, the word doctor would be male or female. My pronouns are they, them. In Spanish, they is either male or female. Do you consider yourself Latinx? In Spanish, traditional Spanish, that would be Latino or Latina if it were a male Latino, if it were a female Latina. And so somebody who considers themselves Latino or Latina may answer no to this question. So that could confuse the demographics. You want more information about like which terms the Latin American community or the Hispanic community, I'm going to try to use the word Hispanic because the surveys that have been done on the Hispanic community in the US show that that is the term that is most preferred. So you can do some online searching. The Pew Research Center for Hispanic Latino Identity is a good source. And then also just looking up attitudes towards gender neutral Spanish. So let me talk a little bit about the survey demographics. And I'm going to check my clock every now and then because I want to leave time for questions and answers. Basically, we had 1,244 respondents, 53 languages, 871 respondents for Spanish, representing 21 different countries. And here's kind of a breakdown. The largest group of our survey participants were from 41 to 60 years of age and had 6 to 10 years of experience. Employment status, primarily hospital staff, but the second largest group were freelance interpreters. And the mode of interpreting, primarily on-site interpreting. Of course, that relates very nicely with the hospital staff. Or all equally, that's over the phone interpreting, video remote interpreting, and on-site interpreting. So those were our two largest groups in terms of the mode of interpreting. And then gender identity, primarily female, which matches in general, most interpreters are female. Male, and then there were a few that answered not sure, transgendered or non-binary or other. So let's take a look at terminology first. So here are some of the questions we asked. Have you heard and do you use the term Latinx or Latine? Latine is another gender neutral version that has been coined in Spanish. To whom do these terms apply? Have you heard and do you use they, them as a third person singular? So in English, there's a long history of using they, them, especially in literature, to mean he or she if you do not know the gender of the person. And then the question was, has they, them caused any misunderstandings while you're interpreting? And how do you interpret they, them into Spanish as a third person singular pronoun? In other words, they, them to replace he or she. So as you can see here in this graph, most often it was heard in English. 816 have heard the term Latinx, and 450 have heard the term Latine, which is interesting that that Latine was heard in, actually Latine was not heard that often in English, but it was heard, oh, I'm sorry. Yes, it was heard a lot in English. It was 450 times. But the term that is most used in is the Latinx in English in terms of the interpreters. So the interpreters have heard Latinx most, and they use it most. And then the second one is Latine in English and Latinx in Spanish. And then Latine in Spanish was significantly lower. So 64% do not use either term. And that was 648 versus 362. So when we looked at the demographics of this, basically what we found was that the younger and the fewer years of experience, there was an increase in the use of Latinx and Latine. So basically, the younger interpreters and the interpreters with less experience tend to use the terms more often. However, we have to keep in mind that age and years of experience are not necessarily independent factors. There are some people who became interpreters later in life, but in general, the older the person is, the more years of experience they have interpreting. What was really interesting is that there was no difference in the use of Latinx or Latine by their employment status or by their interpreting mode. So as you can see, staff and freelancers, basically those that use the term and those that do not use the term are about equal, the two bars, right? The blue bar being staff and the orange bar being freelance. Um, and likewise, those who are working remotely or on site or both, there was no significant difference in who is using these terms and who is choosing not to use these terms. Interestingly, there was no difference in the use of these terms by gender identity either. You can see here female using Latinx or Latine, and female who do not use either term, male, and those who identified as transgender, non-binary, or other. So we asked the question, do you think that the term Latinx, Latine are acceptable synonyms for Latin Americans in English in general? And what we can see here is that there's a switch kind of at the between the 40 and 41 year brackets. So those who in the younger categories, there was more agreement that yes, it is an acceptable synonym. And here at the 31 to 40 age group, it was about evenly split. When we get to the 41 age group and above, you can see it kind of flips and there's more disagreement with this statement. Now, a word of caution here, the under 21 years of age, there was only one respondent in each of these two categories. So these numbers are really way too low to make any kind of generalizations. When we ask the question, Latinx and Latine are acceptable synonyms for Latinos and Latinas in Spanish, um, basically we see that that age group kind of jumps up a little bit. So we're getting our 41 to 50-year-olds is where our split is. And then in the older interpreters, they disagree with that statement, and the younger interpreters tend to agree with that statement. Then we ask the question, Latinx and Latine are acceptable terms only for transgender and non-binary Latin Americans. And basically here, everybody disagrees with this statement. So nobody thought that these terms are only applicable to Latin Americans who are transgender or non-binary. We wanted to know if interpreters, their friends, their family, they personally identify with these terms or use these terms. And so those who identify with Latine, Latinx, and both versus those who do not identify with either. And as we can see, the majority don't identify with either group, but there is a significant number of people who do identify with these terms. So we wanted to get a little deeper into how interpreters deal with the use of they, them. For example, if a doctor introduces themselves and says, hi, I'm Dr. Smith and my pronouns are they, them. How do interpreters deal with that? So the majority of respondents have heard they, them used as a singular pronoun in English. That was 515. Most do use these terms in English. Or Spanish or both languages. And so these are the folks that use the terms. Here's 230 plus 194 plus 22. And 424 do not use the terms in either language. And 193 have not even heard of the terms. So most respondents felt these terms caused confusion while interpreting, about 53%. 43% use a Spanish gendered form. In other words, they just say ellos or ellas, which would be ellos would be they masculine and ellas would be they feminine. And only 4.6% use a gender neutral term in Spanish when interpreting. And these are the terms that have been coined that are most frequent in Spanish for saying a neutral they, them. And that's putting an X or an E at the end of the word. I kind of lose my mouse occasionally, so I apologize for that. And here down below, we've added some information for those who are non-Spanish speakers. They with an AS at the end is female. They with an OS at the end is male. Some just interpret it as he, she, but we'll see this on the next slide. So here are some of the solutions that interpreters have come up with when they are faced with the singular use of they, them in English. Most respondents use a gendered form in Spanish, either singular or plural. So they either say he, she, or they say they feminine or they masculine. And I think it would be interesting to do additional surveys to find out why they choose those solutions. 17.6% use meaning clarification or cultural clarification when interpreting the singular they, them on the job. So that would be people who either take the time to explain the situation to the doctor, that they, them in Spanish is either masculine or feminine, or they take the time to explain to the patient the use of they, them as a gender neutral pronoun in English. Now, as we saw in our example in Spanish, all of the words in the sentence need to coordinate with the noun. So if the noun is masculine, the article needs to be masculine, the adjective needs to be masculine. So we were interested in how interpreters deal with this. So okay, this I just talked about. The adjectives and articles must match. So the red magazine is La Revista Roja. The red book is El Libro Rojo. So the adjective and the article match the gender of the noun. Article and adjective match the gender of the noun. So the task we gave them was to interpret into English this simple phrase, which in English is the Latin American community, but we put it in a gender neutral term. Or interpret into Spanish a Latinx adult. And what we found was 45% prefer an English only rendition, Latin American community. So an English gender neutral rendition of La Comunidad Latina. Okay. 21% use what we call the generic masculine form in Spanish. So Latino community. In other words, if you don't know the gender of the group of people, in Spanish, you default to the masculine. 34% preferred a non-traditional gender rendition. So Latinx community, Latina community, or using the feminine as a generic gender, Latina community. And so just to clarify that the two English only renditions are this Latin community and Latin American community, these two combined. So we wanted to know, well, what would they do with the article and what would they do with the noun, right? Because Latino, in this case, Latina, Latine, and Latinx are the adjective describing the noun or the community. And the top preference, of course, was for all terms to be in the generic masculine. This is the traditional Spanish version, right? So still the majority of interpreters are just opting for the traditional Spanish version. Um, the second most preferred terms were with the final E for the article and the noun, but using the final X for the adjective. So that was interesting because it was a mixed concordance using the Latin X for the adjective, whoops, but sticking to the more Spanish style version for the noun and for the article. And when I say the more Spanish style version is because there are words that end in E in Spanish, but there are no words that end in X in Spanish. And it's in Spanish, this is very hard to pronounce, an X at the end of a word, whereas an E at the end of the word is much easier to pronounce in Spanish. So the top preference for the sentence Latin X adult again was the generic standard um, masculine in Spanish. But the second most chosen version was the generic masculine for the article and for the noun with the Latin X version for the adjective. So again, a mix of concordance, right? With masculine, masculine, and then the gender neutral adjective. So finally, we wanted to ask about attitudes. What do interpreters think and what do they feel about these gender neutral terms? And this is what we found, basically, that people who thought they were not necessarily or not necessary or not useful was about 28%. Positive attitudes, people who thought that they were necessary and useful was about 31%. And then a more neutral attitudes was about 41%. And those attitudes included things like, languages evolve, languages change over time, or that human gender is not equal to linguistic gender. So they could be decoupled. And so the categories that people responded in are basically languages evolve, speakers will decide. Linguistic gender is not equal to human gender identity. These terms are important, these terms are useful, or these terms are not necessary, or these terms are not useful. So basically, that is, let me get out of my slide here. Okay, so I just want to quickly review. That's all of the data from the survey. So I just wanted to review that attitudes While 41% agreed that linguistic gender and human gender identity are not the same thing, and that speakers of Spanish will eventually decide the fate of gender neutral inclusive terms, nearly a third of survey respondents felt gender neutral terms are useful and are important. And more than a quarter, 28%, feel these terms are unnecessary and not useful. So, in general, most respondents consider gender neutral inclusive terms to be important and needed, but which terms and how they are incorporated into everyday language are yet to be determined. And they should not necessarily be equated to grammatical gender. Conclusions with Latinx and Latina, a majority of the respondents have heard both terms used in both languages. The term Latinx is the more common term. However, a majority do not use either term. The use of the terms decreases with age and experience, which again are not independent factors. And there's no significant difference between freelance staff interpreters or the mode of interpreting or the work environment in terms of whether they use them or do not use them. And we see no difference in the use of these terms based on the gender identity of the interpreters. However, I do want to point out that the transgender and non-binary responses was limited. There were only 26 responses in that category. So that might be worth doing some additional survey investigations.
Mateo,
Yes.
just a brief chime in. We can see your notes. I didn't know if you were intended for us to see your notes. And I just wanted for you to pause for a second. We
Sure.
still have half an hour. I see a lot on the chat, people saying that this is very confusing. I
Okay.
didn't know if you can chime in just for a second before you continue.
Yeah.
Maybe kind of like giving us some hope because I see so much like this is so confusing, this is so confusing. So
Yeah.
just something to appease people on how they can embrace this new information.
Okay, that sounds good. Let's do that because I want to make this useful for the people who are here. So rather than reading through, yeah, and the reason I'm showing the notes is so that I can see them myself. Um, but let's stop here then, and what I can do is I can go back to any slides that people want to go over in more detail, and let's go ahead and get some of that confusion resolved. So is somebody going to monitor the questions
Yes,
or?
I'm
Okay.
looking at the questions. So let's see. Well, somebody just mentioned Latin is also the way to pronounce Latinx in Spanish. Then the next question is there a gender neutral way to say nationalities like Venezolano, Venezolana? So that would be the first question from the Q&A.
Yes. So that's a great question. And it depends. There are nationalities where the nationality is gender neutral in Spanish. For example, estadounidense, which would be a US person, is gender neutral. But the article you would use would depend on the gender of the person. Um, And then there are nationalities that use a gendered version. For example, Mexicano or Mexicana, but Costarricense, Costarricense. It doesn't, it depends
Mhm.
on the country.
Okay. And again, everyone,
Let's
if you
see.
want to put questions, please put them in the Q&A. Another one that I see here, did you offer AJ as a Spanish translation of singular they, them in the study? If not, why not? This is what I have heard most in Mexico City, for example.
Right there. Yes. AJ with the final E was one of the options.
Okay, well, very good. Excellent.
Yes. So
Thank
the
you.
answer is yes.
So the answer is yes. Okay, awesome. Okay, next one. I always struggle when the medical assistant talks about the doctor, and I
Mhm.
still don't know the doctor's gender.
Mhm.
How to correctly interpret in Spanish el doctor o doctora? El médico?
Uh-huh. Yeah, exact. That's a really, really good question. And and there's no right answer because because I don't like to tell people how to interpret. What I do is I will do some cultural clarification. I would transparently intervene and ask the speaker if the doctor they're referring to is a male doctor or a female doctor. But
Excellent.
that's what I do. I'm not telling you to do that. You need to find your own path. But that's what I do.
And that seems to me very reasonable, Mateo, right? Is to get clarification if they just keep saying el doctor. I mean, the doctor, we don't know if it is la doctora or el doctor.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes. Okay, so here's another one. I was translating once for a young girl of about 15 years old who
Mm-hmm.
came from a country where the existence of such a thing as they, them is unknown. I
Right.
opted to completely ignoring this part of what was spoken in the room because I would take too long to explain the concept of gender neutrality to her. What else
Mm-hmm.
I could have done? What a great question to translate it or interpret properly without confusing my client.
Very good question. Yes. And I think this is one of the reasons why we wanted to do this survey was
Mhm.
because often, depending on the person we are interpreting for, often they don't understand the American culture of using gender neutral terms. Um, so it can cause some confusion. And this is why we asked that question, and I'm looking for it here. Uh, yeah, so most respondents felt these terms caused confusion while interpreting, 53%. So you're not alone, is the first thing I want to say.
Mhm.
It does cause confusion when we're interpreting. Um, and I think the solutions are kind of presented here. And what is interesting to me is that most of the respondents are just interpreting. They're just using a gendered form. So if the doctor says, "Hi, my name is Dr. Smith. My pronouns are they, them." It seems like most of them are just saying, "Hi, my name is Dr. Smith," or ignoring
Mhm.
it completely, or saying, "My name is Dr. Smith. My pronoun is he," or "My pronoun is she," depending on what the interpreter is perceiving the gender of that doctor to be. Um, which is interesting to me because I'm wondering, why are they doing that? Is it because they know this is a dermatology appointment and they only have 5 minutes? And they don't want to spend 2 minutes explaining the use of they, them in English to a Spanish speaker? Or I don't know. I mean, we would need additional research and additional surveys to
Mhm.
find out why people are doing that. My feeling is it's probably just a practical issue. They know that medical appointments are time sensitive. And so they want to interrupt as little as possible. And they just kind of want to move on and get the patient um, through the appointment. But that's just a guess. That's just a hypothesis. I have no data to back that up.
Wow, much more research needs to be done about this topic. Okay, so let me see what other questions, if we can answer questions, and if we have time, we continue.
Okay. Let me just say that
Yes.
another option is basically don't take on responsibilities that aren't yours as the interpreter,
Mm,
and just clarify with the doctor that in Spanish the term they them is either masculine or feminine. Um,
mhm.
what do they want you to do? Is it okay if they just use your name? Um, is it okay if would they prefer to have the pronoun be masculine or feminine? Um, I presented this to a doctor once, and the doctor perceived to be female, but preferred I used he, him for the pronouns. So I proceeded to interpret using he, him, using uh, the masculine pronouns. But that was that one particular doctor. That doesn't mean
Mhm.
every doctor is going to be okay with that.
Right. Okay, no, this is so educational for all of us, Mateo, and giving us some clear guidance on what we can at least attempt to do, right? As we're dealing with this challenge. Okay, it says, sorry, but why are we perpetrating the huge linguistic mistake to name Latin to languages that are not Roman languages? Hmm.
That's an interesting question. Yes. Actually, the term, a lot of people in English want to use the term, well, they started using in English the term Latino because they thought it was being culturally sensitive to the Latin American community or the Hispanic community. Um, but then they run into this issue of, well, it's not gender neutral, so now let's make it gender neutral. So they started using Latin X, which is not really a Spanish term. So on the one hand, they're
Mhm.
being culturally sensitive, but on the other hand, they're not being so culturally sensitive towards the language. The actual term Latino or Latin to be used for like Latin Americans or Hispanics is actually a colonist, a colonial term that was coined by the French to refer to people from Latin America. So it's actually kind of an imperialistic term. And maybe that's why the Pew Research
Mhm.
surveys found that most people of Hispanic origin in the US prefer the term Hispanic rather
Mhm.
than Latino. However, in English, there is a term, Latin American, and it is a gender neutral term and it is a valid English word.
Yes.
So um, I I feel like if you're going to be speaking English, you should be using English terms. So,
Mhm.
but that's my personal bias.
Mhm. No, but it's good to hear the different perspective, Mateo. Okay, so let's see what other it says. Excellent presentation y tema. Mateo, he wrote this in Spanish. Someone to do side translation.
Okay.
I, so it says, excellent presentation and topic, Mateo. Thank you very much. I would like to know your opinion about the following. The term comunidad.
Mhm,
It is a neutral term.
mhm,
La comunidad latinoamericana, the Latin American community involves both female and males from Latin America.
mhm.
The same when we say equipo médico o el equipo de enfermería. I'm just going to read it in Spanish. Incluye a los médicos y a las médicas y a los enfermeros y a las
Mhm.
enfermeras.
Correct.
So I'm not really sure what the question here is.
I think I understand. So there are ways of speaking more gender neutral in Spanish without altering the
Mm,
grammar of Spanish. For example, you could talk about los Latinos, which is masculine, or you could say la comunidad latina, which is feminine, right? So you can choose. So los Latinos would just be Latin Americans, and La Comunidad Latina would be the Latin American community in English, right? One is masculine, one is feminine. So there are ways of getting around the strict use of the generic masculine in Spanish by being a little bit more creative with our language. I think that's the point they were trying to make. But if not, feel free to clarify it in the chat.
yes, and ladies and gentlemen, and everyone, please, questions in the Q&A. That's where I'm reading the
Oh,
question.
sorry, in the Q&A.
Yes,
Clarify
is
it in
there
the
a
Q&A.
structure? Okay, so let's see. Okay, so the question here again, how is ELLX pronounced? I'm not sure if they mean ella, ella, or ELLX.
That's a really good question.
Oh we're suffering here with this webinar, Mateo. Great questions. How do
That's
we
a
answer
really good
them?
question. Yeah, it's not a Spanish form. So in Spanish, uh, in Spanish, we would say la pronunciación está muy rebuscada. You have to
Ajá.
really search to figure out how to pronounce a word like that in Spanish. Um, and I think that's part of the problem is
Yes.
and so a lot of Spanish speakers that prefer to use gender neutral terms use the final E instead of an A or an O. So because
Oh,
it's a
like
lot
ella. Ella es
ella,
neutral,
see,
it's neutral.
it's much easier to pronounce that in Spanish. It's much easier to
Ajá.
pronounce Latine within final E than Latinx with the X at the end.
I agree with you. That's brilliant, Mateo. You need to write something about it.
Oh,
You
I don't
do.
need to write anything about it. People have come up with that themselves. Um, it's language evolves.
Yes. Okay, now I know what to use. It's just ella, because ella is neutral. No es ella, no es él, es ella. Okay, awesome. Okay, so let's see. Otra pregunta. Okay, I'm going to read it in Spanish and then I'll side translate. Otra pregunta. ¿Qué te parece esto? Cuando alguien se presenta con los pronombres they, them, yo interpreto como usa pronombres neutros o ella, pero creo que en general los pacientes no lo entienden. So I guess in summary, the question is when somebody is using a pronoun they, them, she's trying to use the neutral term or the ella. I guess you can explain it better, Mateo.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing in that question is that you're doing what we would call cultural clarification, right? So you're among the 17.6% here who are using meaning clarification or cultural clarification. You're you're stepping out of your interpreting role, out of your message conduit role into the message clarifier role, and you're clarifying to the patient this doctor uses a non-standard pronoun that is gender neutral, and one version of it is ella. And so that's the pronoun you will use in the interpretation. And that's perfectly fine. I think that's a fine way of dealing
Mhm.
with it. Yeah, absolutely.
I
Um,
like simple. I like
yeah,
simple. Let's make things, simple because otherwise we get into all these nuances, right? And we can just, I think, at some point as interpreters, know what is going to be best to be able to proceed with clarity and not to take too much time trying to figure out how to what a neutral.
yeah. And just to clarify, it's not always one way. It's not always just from English into Spanish, right? I was speaking to an
Mhm.
interpreter the other day, and they said they were in a session where the patient, pediatric patient, was transgendered and was using
Mhm.
the feminine pronouns,
Mm.
and the mother was not happy about it and was using the birth pronouns, the masculine pronouns, and the doctor was using the patient's preferred pronouns, and the mother was getting
Mm.
upset about it. Um, and so that those were Spanish patients and a Spanish mother working with an English speaking doctor through an interpreter. So it's not just from English into Spanish. You could also encounter this in Spanish going back into English.
Interesting. Okay, so here's another one. Can we discuss a real life use such as the patient who is a day wants to make an appointment? How do we tackle this in Spanish?
So the patient who uses they, them pronouns.
And so how are you going to make the appointment? So, okay. The patient who is a they.
Hmm.
So maybe they are using they, the patient, wants to make an appointment. How do we tackle this in Spanish?
In Spanish. Seems like if the patient, so the patient is English speaking and they want to make an appointment in a Spanish speaking clinic, it sounds like. Um, I would just say the patient on the phone wants to make an appointment. But yes, you'd have to say el paciente o la paciente. That's a
Mm,
good one. I don't have an answer.
yeah. This is,
The way I get out of this is I say, I don't like to tell people how to interpret. So
my goodness, no, there is a lot to think about. Okay, so let's see.
I think I would probably do meaning clarification. I'd say I have a patient on the phone and the patient
Mhm,
uses non-gendered pronoun they, them,
mhm.
and they want to make an appointment or use their name. I have a patient. The patient's name is Lee, and Lee wants to make an appointment.
You know what? Great. Both alternatives work really well, Mateo. I really like that. Okay, here is another one. If the gender is unknown when they say the doctor will be in shortly, do you always default to masculine, el doctor, even if the doctor could be a female? I would say yes, because
Mhm.
that's just me answering right now. I'll let you answer. You're the expert here.
No, no, I'm not the expert. When it comes to solutions, there is no expert because you basically do what you feel is best at the moment in the exam room with the patient. Um, Ideally, I wouldn't be with the patient without the doctor there in the exam room.
Mhm.
So I would have time to do my pre-session introduction, and I would know the preferred pronouns of the doctor before we go into the exam room to see the patient. That would be the ideal situation, but we all know that doesn't always happen. Sometimes you
Right.
get stuck in a room with a patient. Um, you can always just say el doctor o la doctora will come in shortly,
Mhm.
right? Either the female or the male doctor will be in here soon. The patient might even know the doctor, so they might be able to clarify for you. Oh, it's
Ah,
el doctor.
Mateo, and as a Spanish born speaker, I know that if I just hear el doctor ya viene,
Right,
that could be either female or male, because
right,
sometimes you could use it for both, right?
right,
So I would just say, if I hear as an interpreter, the nurse says, the doctor is coming and I'm going to interpret that, el doctor ya viene, because in reality, in Spanish,
right.
we could infer it could be male, female, if we don't have a pronoun. And then when the doctor comes, then we see either one. Okay, very good.
Exactly, exactly. And that's what we call the generic masculine, which is the traditional Spanish way of speaking, right?
Yes.
But it kind of gets back to the earlier question about alternatives in Spanish that are acceptable. For example, we used to always say the female nurse, right? Because most nurses were female. But that's not so much the case anymore. So there are ways of saying that now. For example, you could say the nursing staff, right? So that's a more generic way of including um, all nurses. If you don't want to use the generic masculine for nurses, which honestly feels a little weird to me because I guess we're just so used to using the female term for nurses
Hmm.
that using the generic masculine feels strange to me. So I'll say things like, el personal de enfermería, right? The nursing staff, to refer to a group of nurses. So there are ways of getting around it in Spanish.
Okay, so let's go to other questions here. And I know the chat is really active and people are disagreeing on a few things, which is perfectly
Good.
fine. It's perfectly fine. We're
Next
all
time we do
trying
a
to.
survey, make sure you fill it out because we want all of your opinions.
Yes, yes, yes. Okay, here comes another question. Oh gosh. How do you pronounce, and again, ELLX, UNX, adult, TX, etc. in Spanish? I never heard that there is a way to pronounce it.
Yeah, I honestly, I have no idea.
Yes,
Unix, Latinx, Adultex,
to
but
be honest with you,
it does not sound good.
I don't think, at least when I go back to Panama and I speak to different people, I have never heard it as of yet. It doesn't
Right.
mean that I won't, but I don't think it's actively known in other countries, right? Maybe in the US, we're beginning to use those terms.
Well, this
Okay.
is interesting because the Fundeo, which is a foundation in Spain that does a lot of research on linguistics, Spanish linguistics, they did this interesting study where they looked at hundreds of thousands of social media posts from all over the Spanish speaking world. And they found a similar results that basically different countries are using different forms of the gender neutral terms. Um, and there doesn't seem to be any pattern emerging yet.
Hmm.
In each country, they use both of these forms and some other interesting forms, but no country used like only one form, and the forms changed between countries also. So it's like it seems like basically we're in this period where the idea is out there in the language and people are playing and exploring with it. And there are several solutions that have come up, but we're just kind of throwing ideas out there right now to
Hmm.
see if something sticks. And eventually something might stick and the language might evolve and incorporate that into the Spanish language. We don't know because we can't determine how language is going to evolve.
I think, Mateo, we still have 5 more minutes before we get to the bottom of the hour, and the webinar is formally over. But
Mhm.
I do want to say, you have recommended over and over, as I recall throughout the webinar, a best practice, which is clarification. If we are unsure, because I think as we face this wave, something that is new for us, right? For some of us, I would say a challenge for me because it's new to me. To some people, they may be more familiar with all the ins and outs and the nuances. I think best practice is to clarify, right? Until we're clear on what we should use and do the best that we can. And then to know that we are going to learn as we go. I don't think at this point we have like, hey, this is the solution for everything. And that's what I hear you say, in several occasions.
I would tend to agree personally. I think that I as an interpreter, I don't like to step out of my lane. I don't like to take on responsibilities that I feel are not mine. Um, so so in a case like this, yes, I would prefer to punt it back to the speaker and
Mhm.
explain the dilemma and let them help me decide what to do. Um,
Exactly.
in going from Spanish to English, I think it's a little more straightforward. If we have a patient that's using, that says, oh, my pronouns are ella or
Mhm.
ellex, then
Mhm.
I think it's a little more straightforward because we have that opportunity in English to say, my pronouns are they, them. And most
Mhm.
people nowadays would understand that, right? They might roll their
Mhm.
eyes or they might say, perfect, my pronouns are they, them also. Um, but going from English into Spanish, I think is where it can be a little more confusing. Um, primarily because the Spanish language is just not built that way, but also because a lot of our patients have not been exposed to that part of American culture, and
Mm-hmm.
so they can be confused. I mean, I'm sure when I was using the he him pronoun in that particular case that I mentioned, um, I know the patient was a little bit confused because I could see it
Mm-hmm.
on the patient's face. But the patient didn't say anything. They just rolled with it. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Okay, so let's see one more question. Uh, oh, okay. So this goes along with what I just mentioned, okay? And I
Mhm.
think this is a good last question before we get to the bottom of the hour and the
Okay.
webinar is formally over. Do you have conclusions or recommendations for best practices based on your data?
No.
Okay.
And the reason I say no is because what our data shows is what interpreters are doing,
Mm, mhm,
what the majority of interpreters are doing. Um, Whether they're doing it right or wrong, I think that depends on the situation. So I never want to, even my students, I never tell them
mhm,
when it comes to ethical dilemmas, when it
mhm,
comes to clarifications, I always tell them there are no right or wrong answers. I can tell you what I've done in the past, but that
mhm,
doesn't mean I'm going
mhm.
to do that in the next situation
That's right.
I'm in,
Mhm,
right? Because
mhm.
every situation is different. And that's why we are a practice profession, right?
That's
Because
right.
every situation is different. Um, so what the survey tells you, it's a snapshot. It tells
Mhm,
you what interpreters are doing, what interpreters with different age brackets are doing, um, what
mhm,
interpreters that work in different settings might be doing. But it doesn't really tell you this is how you should do it. And I think, again, I think that's something um, that will hopefully evolve in the Spanish language, evolve among Spanish speakers. At some point, we might come up with a nice solution that
mhm.
most people agree with and feel comfortable with, and we will have that incorporated into our language.
That was a wonderful last minute or no, last moment words or final words, Mateo. I love it. And la gente dice, te está dando estrellitas y dice, gracias, Mateo. Okay, so everyone, we are at the bottom of the hour. It's 12:30 Eastern Time. The webinar is formally over. We really appreciate all of your comments. Mateo, I just want you to know we had over 1,000 people today.
Oh,
For better or for worse, Mateo, my partner in crime. So we had over 1,000 people. That has been a long time. We have reached almost the 1,000, but not quite. So thank you. I see everybody saying thank you, thank you, thank you. Amazing work. This is a very challenging topic to present, Mateo, and you have done a fantastic job. And I think it was not that you were not clear enough, it's that the topic itself is
yes.
complex and there is so much to navigate. And I appreciate that at some point you decided, okay, let's go ahead and answer some questions because I think, we spent the last half an hour doing that.
Mhm.
And I think that was more beneficial than just continue going through data when people were trying to figure out, what to do. So Mateo,
Absolutely.
we're going to let you go.
Okay,
Okay?
thank you. Yeah, I
You
agree. I think that the questions clarified the data better than just looking at the numbers and the charts. So thank you, everybody. You guys all did a wonderful presentation. Claps.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for your wonderful questions. And Mateo, I'll be in touch. Have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day. And everybody, bye Mateo, everybody that we just want you to know the webinar is formally over. So again, you will receive a link in hopefully in the next 48 hours, right? To download your certificate of attendance. Please make sure you download it, that you type your name so that you get admitted to obtain your CEs and all of that. So we're just going to let you go. Have a wonderful, fantastic day, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you in April. Bye, everyone. Thank you.